a larger project of mine called Torah Flora, which involves speaking and writing and leading botanical garden tours and teaching in general about ways that secular knowledge, primarily science, but also other things, can be an aid to Torah study. That we do not need to see it as an opposition or in competition with Torah, but in fact, the two can often be mutually beneficial and enriching. So I hope to show you a few examples tonight of how a little bit of knowledge of science and history can help us to enrich and deepen our appreciation of and understanding of Torah. Okay, so this is sort of a multidisciplinary approach. So if you look at, I'm going to show you a little bit about the book first of all, and you'll see that this is reflected there. Okay, I need screen sharing also, please, if you could. Do we have that? Let's see. No, I need permission to share the screen here.
Okay, you should have it now.
Yes, thank you. Here we go. Okay, so here is the cover of the book. Okay, and you can see at the bottom a panel from an ancient Egyptian wall painting of agriculture in ancient Egypt. And at the top, agriculture today practiced by Jews, independent Jews, not slaves, who are in their own independent country of Israel. So this progression is sort of part of the story here. You can see the subtitle also, Ancient Seder Insights from Nature, Food, and Farming, is meant to sum up the approach. Now, in order to accomplish this, I wanted to have my work checked by people who had expertise in different fields. This is a little small to read, but what I wanted to point out by showing you the back cover is that the readers I asked to evaluate what I was doing and point out any errors cover a very wide range of fields. There's several rabbis whose names are on here. There's an archaeologist and archaeobotanist from Bar-Ilan University, Professor Zohar Amar. Some of you may know the names of Rabbi David Foreman and Menachem Ganak and Nigel Savage.
No one cares. No one likes you. Please be quiet.
Let's mute yourself there, please. Nigel Savage, the president and founder of Chazon, which is a Jewish environmentalist organization. Erica Brown is a name some of you may know, is a very broad-minded Jewish thinker. Joan Nathan and Levana Kirschenbaum, known primarily for their work with Jewish food as cookbook writers and historians of Jewish food. And Joan Gardner is a gardening writer who also spent some time doing research in Israel and came up with a book about biblical gardens. And finally, Ed Bez, who is a Protestant minister and the president of the Biblical Botanical Garden Society. So a pretty wide range. And I tried to carry through on this as well in the book itself. So for example, here are the footnotes at the bottom of a typical page of the Haggadah. You can see the strategy here was to write a commentary that's pretty accessible and understandable to people with a basic knowledge of the Seder and not necessarily have to have a lot of deep scholarship. However, the footnotes are there for anyone who wants to follow up in more depth. So you can see 3 of these footnotes are to pages of Talmud and Mishnah. 2 of them are to classical Latin poetry. One is the Oxford History of Italian Food. There's a reference to Shakespeare. And finally, a scientific paper on the taste and distaste for cilantro. Okay, and then the other thing that came out from the research for this that I thought was very interesting, because it fit with a longstanding interest of mine, is that many things that we do at the Seder are very longstanding, but their meaning, or at least how we understand their meaning, has changed over the years. And in some cases, they've acquired multiple meanings. So at the end of many sections, I have a little here. Here's an example of one with a green background here and a little graphic element to make it stand out, called What Does It Mean? So there's one on karpas, there's one on maror, and so forth, summarizing the multiplicity of meanings that many of these things have acquired in different times. Okay, so what's in the book? So let's talk about a few stories that come from the Haggadah. This one, the picture on this page here, by the way, is an interesting story in itself. This is a photo of a banana plant that has been cut down after the bananas were harvested. You can see this little sprout begin to grow up in the middle there. But what's most interesting about it is that you can see it is not actually the trunk of a tree. It's a tightly rolled bundle of leaves. The banana, strictly speaking, botanically is what we call an herb rather than a tree. It has no long-lived woody tissue like a tree. For this reason, it can be used as karpas. And indeed, in the late 19th and early 20th century in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Rabbi Pryal and later his son-in-law, Rabbi, whose name I've forgotten, continued the practice of using a banana as their karpas on their Seder plate in order to teach recent immigrants from Eastern Europe who weren't familiar with bananas that this was a fruit of which the correct bracha is Borei Priya Dama, not Borei Priya Eitz. It's fruit of the earth, not fruit of a tree. So this became known as the Elizabeth, New Jersey Seder plate. Okay, so that's sort of, there are things like that that we come up with along the way. So here's the first real substantive story here. This plant here is an ornamental form of a group of plants called wormwood. They are toxic, and they are often used as ornamental plants in this part of the world. The reason that absinthe was banned in many countries is that it's a liquor made from this herb, and it contained a toxin, which it's been redesigned so that it doesn't contain the toxin. But that was the reason that it was banned, because of the brain damage it was causing. Now, what does it mean here about reversing the order of the meaning of maror? So here's the background you need for this to understand it. So the Torah only says that we're to eat the Paschal lamb with maror, with a bitter herb. It doesn't say what it is or what its significance is. The Mishnah, so the first real codification of Jewish law from about roughly the 1st century of the Common Era, lists 5 species that can be used for this purpose. And the Gemara and all succeeding commentators universally agree that they're in descending order of desirability. So the first one on the list is lettuce. If you can't find lettuce for any reason at that time, you go to the next one on the list, and so on down there. There are 5 there. 2 of them are not sure what they are. People have different ideas, but none of them is very convincing. First one is definitely lettuce. Another one in Aramaic is hendiva. You can probably guess that in English that would be endive. That's an alternative if you can't get lettuce. And the last one on the list is just called maror, meaning any bitter herb if you can't get any of the others. So the Gemara expands on this Mishnah and explains a little bit more about it, what the criteria are for getting onto the list. So all of these plants are generally in the aster family, including lettuce. And these plants have an acrid white sap that they emit when they're cut. If you've ever cut a head of romaine lettuce near the base, you may notice that sometimes you'll see this sort of white milky sap there. Now that has been bred down to tolerable levels, but originally, and this is still true in the wild lettuce, that sap contained a mildly narcotic and very bitter substance that slowly accumulates as the plant matures. And this turns out to be crucial to why lettuce is maror and horseradish is absolutely not. Why is that? So the Gemara tells a story that could have been written specifically to exclude horseradish, although it was probably unknown in the Middle East at that time. And so what's the story? So one of the rabbis describes that he observed one of his colleagues collecting herbs before Passover. So he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm collecting marir ta." Now, if you know any Aramaic from Talmud study, you know that the ta suffix means the. So marir ta, the bitter, in other words, the really bitter stuff. I'm trying to collect the most bitter herb I can find to really beautify the mitzvah and do this really as well as I can for Passover. The other one said, no. You're going completely in the wrong direction here. This is not what we learned. Don't you remember what we learned? We're supposed to, someone needs to mute themselves. I'm sorry, I don't know who it is, but I keep hearing the same sound, probably from the same source.
I'm staying on top of that.
Thank you. Okay, so so why lettuce? So he said it's just like the Egyptians, right? When we got to Egypt in the time of Joseph, it was great, right? We were close with the Pharaoh. He gave us the best jobs, the best land, right? Everything was terrific. And then slowly, little by little, it began to deteriorate. Eventually, we wound up in slavery. Okay, so he said, this is the Midrash that summarizes, Kach hayu Mitzrim. This is how the Egyptians were, like this plant. Tchila torach v'sofo mar. In the beginning, it's mild, its end is bitter. So what is he referring to? The lettuce plant, if you leave it in the ground and don't harvest it, will slowly begin to accumulate more and more of this bitter narcotic compound called lactusin. It's the reason that lettuce was used in earlier times as we would use Tylenol or aspirin now for fever and pain when people are sick and to help them sleep. Until finally, by the summer, it's completely inedible and actually even kind of thorny, right? So what's the idea? The point of maror is not what you might think if you grew up as I did with horseradish, that is to compress 200 years of slavery into 30 seconds and blow your head off. right? So the Talmud is specifically telling you, no, that's not the point. The point of maror is to understand, even if this lettuce is not bitter now, early in the spring when I'm eating it, I understand that had I left it in the ground, it would slowly become bitter and intolerable. And that's what we need to be alert to, the danger of anti-Semitism and the danger of oppression and the danger of getting into a trap before it's too late to do anything about it. Right? It's a slow, insidious nature of it. That's what maror is all about. Okay, so that's the Gemara's take on the meaning of maror. Now, we go forward a few centuries to the Shulchan Aruch, late 1500s, and we find something interesting. So the Shulchan Aruch lists all of these. I'm sorry, not quite that far. We'll go to the Ravya. So the Ravya that's an acronym for his name. He was a Rishon, meaning a halachic commentator who lived before the Shulchan Aruch, but after the Talmud. Lived in Bonn, Germany. And in his comments on that particular page of Talmud, he goes through the list and he explains, start with lettuce. If you can't get lettuce, go to the next one on the list. If you can't get that, go to the next. If you can't get any of these things, here he adds his own bit. He says, now bear in mind, he's living in Germany. He writes, if you can't get any of those things, use vermouth. And what is vermouth? You know, it should sound like something. Anybody recognize what that sounds like in English? What sounds like vermouth in English?
Vermouth.
Vermouth, right? Why is vermouth called vermouth? Vermouth is a white wine that's been seasoned with herbs. Originally, it was seasoned with wormwood. Verm is worm and ut is wood. So vermouth in German is wormwood. Okay, so it was formerly used for that purpose. So he says, use this if you can't get anything else for your maror. So what is the meaning of this? Well, we have to look back to the Torah to understand what he's alluding to, why he picked this. So wormwood in biblical Hebrew is called lana. In modern Hebrew, it's called sheba. I think that's probably an Arabic name. I haven't tracked that down yet. But in biblical Hebrew, it's lana. So the Torah warns us against something that is poreh rosh v'lana, flowering with toxic plants and wormwood. So this is the Torah's metaphor for idolatry and social corruption. That begins with someone who introduces these inappropriate attitudes and desires and behaviors into a community. Right? So what is he saying? Right? This why is this the metaphor for social corruption? So the reason is that the Middle Eastern species of wormwood have very similar environmental requirements to grasses. And so in the grazing areas where nomadic shepherds, like the early Israelites before the time of Joshua, would have brought their livestock.
John, can I just stop you for 1 second here?
Yes.
I'm having a little trouble keeping people muted. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, I've removed somebody, but he keeps coming back in. I am going to set it up so that people cannot unmute themselves. And so we're going to have a little less interchange, but I think it's going to be a little smoother.
Okay, fine, that's fine. So I'm going to suggest. Okay. Oh,
There we go.
There we go. Right. I'm going to suggest if people have questions, they put them in the chat, and then at least you won't forget them, and then we'll address them all at the end.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, great. We'll save a little time for that. Okay. So the problem is if you're a shepherd and you bring your sheep every year to a certain area to graze, and then because Middle Eastern rangeland is not very productive because it's so dry, then you come back the next year when the grass has grown back. But if wormwood has invaded the area, you can't use it at all because the sheep will not distinguish it from the grass. They'll eat it and they'll get very sick and they'll probably die. All right. So it's the one bad apple spoils the barrel kind of situation. Once the area is infested with wormwood, forget it. You can't use it for grazing. So this is the metaphor for this social corruption. Now, why is the Ravya talking about that in the context of maror? Isn't maror about the bitterness of slavery? That's what the Gemara's metaphor seemed to say, right? Little by little, they got bitter as we became enslaved. So it goes back to another statement of the Mishnah, which is about the Magid section, the long section where we tell the story of Passover, right? So the Mishnah is very terse about this. It says, Matchil begnai u'mesayem b'shavach, right? We begin with shame and end with glory. So what is that all about? So the Gemara, of course, has a debate. This, well, what are we ashamed of? What are we supposed to be ashamed of? So and there are two opinions. One, that our ancestors were slaves, avadim hayinu, and that's a very prominent part of the Seder, right? We hear that a lot. The other opinion is Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu, that our ancestors, going back to Terach, the father of Abraham, were idol worshippers. So two different perspectives on what in our history we might be embarrassed about. The predominant one in the Seder, of course, is Avadim Hayinu, that our ancestors were slaves. But now the Ravya, by adding wormwood to the list, is completely reversing the meaning. He's saying, look, if you can't get lettuce, meaning, so to speak, if there's no lettuce, if there's no maror in your life, right? If you are blessed to live in historical circumstances when you are not subject to harassment and anti-Semitism and limits on your religion, and you're able to practice Judaism openly, and you're able to learn Torah openly, and there's no one harassing you and stopping you from doing that, then you don't have maror in your life. So you don't have lettuce, right? So then what do? So you can forget about Avadim Hayinu. That's not your story. Your story is of Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu, meaning we're not going to complain about what someone did to us. We're going to be doing cheshbon nefesh. We're going to examine ourselves, right? And what did we do to bring them upon us any misfortunes that we have, right? Because we have no one to blame if we're living in a benevolent society like that, if we're not living up to our mitzvot. Okay, so what he's done is completely reverse the meaning of maror just by choosing a different vegetable, right? From a commemoration of our ancestors' enslavement to an examination of our own faults. So it's interesting how the little details like this can carry huge theological meaning. We can also see a similar story applied to the meaning of the wine at the Seder. So we're going to look at that one next. Let's see. I think that we want this here. Let's see. We're going to go back to this for a second. Yeah, we'll get to this next. All right, this will be the end of the story. Okay. So the Talmud says, regarding the wine at the Seder, it's preferable to use red wine if you can get it. And it gives as a proof a verse in the book of Proverbs that is really difficult to understand what it has to do with anything. It says something about don't stare at the wine and won't make it turn red. I mean, maybe that implies that red is better than white, but it's not really clear what this is supposed to prove. But it seems to satisfy the Talmud, and they go on in their discussion. Okay, so preferable specifically for the 4 cups, red wine is preferable. Okay, we go fast forward to the Shulchan Aruch. All right, late 1500s. And what do we see here? So the Shulchan Aruch says, repeats the same thing, right? Try to get red wine if you can. This is preferable for the 4 cups. So the Ramah, that stands for Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who was writing at the same time, but he was beat out into print, and so his comments become a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch that's distributed throughout it now, rather than an independent book. He's a little more lenient. He says, well, it is preferable to get red wine, but if you're not able to get red wine that's as good as the white wine you have access to, if you can get better white wine than the red wine that's available, fine, then use white wine. He doesn't explain why. He just is a little more lenient about this. We'll see in a minute why that is, why that probably is true. But the real provocative comment about this comes a little bit later. In the early 1600s, we have the Taz. So Taz is an acronym for Turei Zahav, meaning lines of gold. This is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch written in Poland in the early 1600s. So the Taz says, right, you should use red, but there's an exception, right? And this is fascinating. Bear in mind, he's in Poland now. He says, the exception, of course, here in our country, everybody uses white wine for the Seder. Now, I would eventually say that many of us here have some ancestry in Poland. I would doubt that anyone here has a family custom to use white wine for the Seder. I'm going to please put a note in the chat or something if that's not so. But I have not met any Jew of Polish origins who has a custom to have white wine at the Seder. So here we are in the early 1600s. He says it's universal in Poland. 300 years later, nobody does this. So what's going on here? So he begins to explain the reason. Why did they use white wine? The reason they use white wine, he says, is because of the blood libel, which was very prevalent in 17th century Poland. And the concern was, especially the 3rd cup, when you open the door for Shvoch HaMacha and Elijah, and you're holding cups of red wine, and if your neighbor has some suspicions about what this Passover business is really all about, it's going to confirm all of their prejudices already, if they had that inclination to begin with. And this is going to be evidence to support the blood libel. So he said, just to be on the safe side, we use white in case anyone should see us at doing this to Seder. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, first of all, now we can understand why the Ramah is much more lenient about white wine than the Shulchan Aruch itself, because the Shulchan Aruch was written in a Muslim environment where the blood libel was almost unheard of until late 20th century when it was brought there by Europeans. The Ramah was writing in Europe in a Christian environment where the blood libel was a real live issue. So he had reason to give people permission to use white wine more freely when they felt nervous about being seen with red wine. So that explains that part, but it goes deeper than that. The Taz goes on to explain why is it so important to use red wine? He gives an explanation. He says, well, the red wine alludes to blood. Okay, so he doesn't say what initially, in a minute he does explain what he's referring to, but what do you think of? What in the Seder could be an allusion to blood? Can people unmute themselves now? Is that right?
No, I've left it so people cannot.
Okay, all right, so you can use the chat then. So what are we thinking of at the Seder? What are we talking about where red wine might be an allusion to blood? Where does blood come up in the whole story? If you have an idea, you can put it in the chat. Okay, someone said the plagues. Okay, so the first plague, certainly, right? The Nile River turns red, it calls it blood. Maybe the last plague, the slaying of the firstborn, we don't know exactly how that took place, but certainly it could be that that's an allusion to blood for the slaying of the firstborn. Okay, someone mentioned about Elijah. That's another story. That's not really, I think it's another story altogether. Paschal lamb smeared on the lentil, right? So at the Paschal lamb, you collect the blood before you cook it, and you smear the blood. This was only done in the first Pesach in Egypt. You smear the blood on the doorposts and the lintel of the top, right, as some kind of a sign for protection there. So those are the obvious things, right? So we have three obvious choices: the first plague, the last plague, and the blood of the Paschal lamb. And what does the Taz say? None of those things, right? He reaches past the three obvious explanations and instead reaches for an obscure midrash that I would bet is so obscure many of you have probably never heard of it, which is a midrash that says that the mortar that was used to cement the bricks and stones of the buildings the Jews were required to build in Egypt was mixed with the blood of Jewish children. So apparently the intent of midrash is just to paint the Egyptians in as bad a light as possible. But why would he jump over something that's so obvious, three possible obvious choices, to jump at something so obscure? So I think the reason is that all three of those are part of the story and very essential to the story of Avadim Hayinu, right? We were slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians did this to us. God took us out. What did we do? Not much, really. We were kind of passive in that story, right? That's the dominant story of the Maggid, of the Seder. But the Taz reaches past it to something very different. He's trying to take the symbolism of the red wine out of the context of Avadim Hayinu. So he does it by coming up with some obscure story that alludes to blood that isn't really part of it. It is part of the oppression of the Jews in Egypt, but it's not really essential part of the story of Avadim Hayinu. But the kicker is, the reason we know this was his intention is how he concludes his comments. So he says at the end, and so we use white wine here in Poland because of the blood libel which has come upon us because of our many sins. So see what he's doing with the wine is exactly the same thing that the Ravya did with the maror. He's changing the meaning by some trivial thing at the table, the color of the wine, what vegetable you use for maror, to completely reverse the theology of the Seder for celebrating that the Egyptians oppressed us. Thank God we're done with that. God took us out of Egypt. No, he's going to change the whole story to we have to examine our deeds and identify our sins and remedy them. Right? Complete change in meaning brought on just by a choice of a different color of wine or a different vegetable from maror. So there's a lot of this all throughout the Seder, the table settings, the arrangement of the Seder plate. There are three different major arrangements of the Seder plate. Each one represents a whole different approach to the meaning of the Seder. The charoset recipes. Someone did a master's thesis a couple of years ago in Israel on charoset and identified 70 different versions. It turns out they're in 6 groups they can be classified into, and each of those 6 groups has a different theology. So every detail there has a deep meaning, has a deep history, much of which has been forgotten. Many of these vegetables carry all kinds of connotations that are lost now to most people, but if you dig back into the history and reconstruct them, you find layers and layers and layers of meaning, which is just fascinating. So in fact, with regard to the color of the wine, I can show you now here is a map I put together for the Haggadah showing the red and white wine grape growing areas of France and Germany. Okay, so you can see it's primarily red in France, except for the eastern part of the country, and then the river valleys of Germany, where sweet white wines like Rieslings are primarily grown. The eastern part of France, there where you see those white wine areas. Oh, and so red is red wine, obviously. Yellow is the white wine areas, and the pink is mixed, areas where both red and white grapes are grown. In eastern France is an area called Alsace-Lorraine. It's an area of France that has a heavy German influence. It changed hands a few times historically. There's a strong German cultural influence there. And as you can see in eastern France, that's a white wine growing area. Okay, so what happened here? So in Alsace, everybody drinks white wine. It's a local product. They're very proud of it. And that's what you find there, people drinking white wine, including the Jews. Many Alsatian Jewish families have preserved the custom of using white wine specifically for the third cup at the Seder, because that's the one when the door is open and the neighbors can see. And even if you're saying Shvo Chamadcha in Hebrew, there's always at least one person at the Seder who didn't know much Hebrew, and they're going to say it in the vernacular, which in this case is French. You know, if you open the door and you're all holding cups of red wine, and nobody in town drinks red wine, and the suspicious neighbor is peeking in from their window, and they hear you saying in French, "Pour out your wrath on the nations that have oppressed and devoured the Jews." What do you think they're going to think, right? You're really asking for it. So they still use white wine to this. That's the only trace I've been able to find, and not all Alsatian Jews do this, but it is still a custom that some Alsatian Jews have preserved there. So these things run very deep. Interesting detail about this, by the way, if you look at that German part of the map, these river valleys where white wines are grown in Germany, this is where Jews in Northern Europe first got into winemaking. When they were still required to be moneylenders, occasionally a vineyard owner would get into debt and would have to borrow money. And if they defaulted on the loan, then suddenly the Jewish moneylender found themselves in possession of a vineyard. And so this happened often enough in those areas where winemaking was a major part of the economy, that eventually a whole sort of subculture of Jewish winemaking developed in sort of southwestern Germany, and not in France to my knowledge, but certainly in Germany, we had quite a few Jews that got into winemaking. Okay, so there's a couple. I'm going to skip the Elijah story tonight, I think. That's another story. I don't want to get into that. Okay, this is an interesting one here. Okay, so let's see. Let me get this one for you. Okay, so this is surprising to many people. At the end of the last ice age, the entire Mediterranean coastline, North Africa, Southern Europe, Israel, Lebanon, that whole region was largely forested. It didn't look anything like it does today, the typical kind of rocky, steep, hilly, eroded soil kind of environment with olive trees hanging on to the sides of cliffs and things like that. So how did it change? It changed because as the human population in the area increased, people began to do things like cut down the trees for lumber on hillsides. And so there was no longer trees to catch the impact of raindrops or roots to retain the soil. They began plowing the hillsides to grow grain and other crops, increasing the soil erosion. And they began to bring in sheep for grazing. Now, sheep, unlike cattle, when they eat grasses and other low plants like that, will often pull them completely out of the ground rather than just bite off the top of the leaves as cattle do. So the result was the removal of roots of grasses and trees and other plants from the hillsides, lots of soil erosion, and soon what was left was what we think of today as a typical Mediterranean landscape. Right? And you can see that in the picture on the left here. Right? At the right is all that's left of that old forest. It's in the Atlas Mountains in northern Morocco. This is the only section left in the world where that kind of forest looks like. So if you look at that picture on the right, that's what Greece and Italy and Israel and North Africa looked like, I don't know, maybe 15,000 years ago, something like that. Okay, now on the left, you can see a typical eroded. So if you look carefully, this is taken in one of the Greek islands. You can see the hilltops are, the very tops are quite bare and rocky. There's a little bit of vegetation on the hillsides there, scattered bushes and small scruffy trees, similar to what we call a chaparral landscape in California today. Okay, so this environment continued to be degraded environmentally, and it became a problem. Finally, the Talmud in Baba Kama forbids the raising of sheep in the land of Israel, except for remote desert areas where there's not much population. Just in terms of maintaining the viability of the environment, it was necessary. Problem is, every family has to have a sheep or a goat for Pesach, right? Need a few for a steady supply for the temple. One a day is enough. And then on Shabbat, you need some more. And on holidays, a few more. But that's just for the whole country, just the altar in Jerusalem. But every family needs an animal for a Korban Pesach. So where do you get all these animals if you're not allowed to raise them in the country? And how do you do this without destroying the environment? So Josephus, who was the leader of a Jewish rebellion against Rome, who later betrayed his own cause and joined the Romans, wrote long books about the Jews in their customs and their history and so on. And he describes how it was done. Now, for many years, there was no other evidence this actually was true. Some people weren't sure they believed it. What he wrote was that they would import sheep just before Pesach every year from other countries. And the whole country for a few days or a week was white with sheep. Where you went, you saw sheep. He claimed something like 500,000 sheep were brought in 1 year before Pesach. It's probably an exaggeration. Okay, so we had his testimony, but that's it. There was no physical evidence or other testimony to this idea. Turns out in 2013, an interesting paper was published by a group of archaeologists who had found a garbage dump that had, from Roman times, just outside the walls of Jerusalem where they were at that time, that contained many, many sheep and goat bones, an unusual number of these bones, much more than you'd expect from household use. They said, these are probably the bones of sacrificial animals. Now, it's possible to do an isotopic analysis chemically to determine the forms of carbon and nitrogen that are in the bones, and from that, you can identify the likely geographic origin of the animals. They determined that they had been grazing on desert plants, and in particular, they had originated in the northern Arabian Peninsula. This is incredible. So imagine hundreds of thousands maybe of these sheep and goats every year before Pesach being driven overland from northern Saudi Arabia across the entire width of modern day Iraq and Jordan, all the way to Jerusalem, just for this one event, for this mass slaughter of the Korban Pesach, in order to maintain the holiday and at the same time preserve the land of Israel. So what we get from this is not just history, but a very impressive, inspiring example that our ancestors were so dedicated to preserving the land of Israel and to preserving their religion that they were willing to undergo the hardship of banning a major food source from the whole country, and at great expense and difficulty, once a year, importing these animals just for Pesach so they can maintain the land of Israel's viability and also preserve the observance of Pesach. So it's a very impressive example of environmental dedication and emunah and faith, that they would do this all together. So here's an example where an archaeological paper actually can give us great inspiration and religious encouragement. Let's see, I think I'll do one more story and then we'll start taking questions. Okay, let's see, which one should we do? Just a minute. The pace. This is a fun one, and it's very relevant for this year. It's not so much scientific, but it's a lot of fun. Okay, first you need the background to this one. Okay, the Pesach bunny. So there is a Pesach bunny, and he's coming this year. Some of you may know a little bit about this. So who's the Pesach bunny and what's this all about? So here's where it comes up. One of the questions the Talmud discusses about Pesach is, what do you do when Pesach, or for that matter, any major festival, begins on a Saturday night? Because Shabbat is ending, so we want to make Havdalah, and that has a certain order to it. And the festival is beginning, so we want to make Kiddush. So what do? You make Havdalah and then Kiddush? You make Kiddush and then Havdalah, or do you combine their elements in some way? What are you supposed to do? And they discuss about a half a dozen different alternatives. And the one they settle on is a kind of integrated Havdalah and Kiddush. And they came up with a little mnemonic to help us remember the order of events. It's called Yak Nahaz. Yud Kuf Nun He Zayin in Hebrew. So what is Yak Nahaz? The first letter Yud stands for yayin, or wine. So the first thing you do is Borei Pri Hagafen, right? Blessing on the wine. Next comes Kuf for Kiddush. You recite the rest of the Kiddush, right? Asher Bachar Barim, Mikol Amim, and so forth, right? And then you have Nun for Ner. That's the Borei Morei Ha'esh, the blessing over the candle of Havdalah. And then the Hay is for the Havdalah blessing itself, Hamavdil Ben Kodesh L'chol. And finally, Zion for Shechianu, the Zion for Zman, meaning the time, Shechianu, we say at the end. So that's the order. Okay, now people have noticed some interesting things that have happened about this. It's very common in medieval illuminated manuscripts, both Jewish and Christian, to see all kinds of graphic decorations in the margins, just ornamental. And a common popular one was of a common hobby people had in the Middle Ages, which is hare hunting. Not a Jewish practice, of course, but it was a common decorative element, even in Jewish medieval manuscripts. However, in illuminated Haggadahs, we find this picture on the page with this combined Kiddush and Havdalah, so you know what to do in the case Pesach begins this on Saturday night, as it does this year. So what is this picture of hare hunting doing there? So someone has put in the chat, they're familiar with this part of the story. In German, hunt the hare is Jag dem Hass. Jag dem Hass, hunt the hare, okay? So this was meant to be a reminder in graphic form of what's going on. Now, I have a picture in the Haggadah from the Augsburg Haggadah where they took this a step further. It isn't just a reminder of how to say the blessings at the beginning of the Seder. There's much more to it. Two pictures side by side, two woodcuts, black and white, from 1534, the Augsburg Haggadah from Augsburg, Germany. So what do you see? The first picture on the right shows the hunter with his spear and bow and arrow and his dogs chasing the hares into this net that looks sort of like a big soccer goal. And they're about to get trapped in there. The second picture, the hares have slipped under the net. They're running away and looking back over their shoulders, and the dogs are now getting tangled in the net instead of them. This should sound familiar. This is, of course, the story of crossing the Red Sea. Right? So the hare stands for the harassed, persecuted Jew. The dogs and the hunter are the persecuting German Christians, and there's no caption to the picture.
You haven't shared the picture, by the way.
No, I don't have that one with me tonight, but I'm going to show you a different one in a minute.
Okay.
Okay. So why is there no caption? This was something you couldn't say openly, right? All these Jewish books are being censored by the crown and the church, but you could put a picture of animals in and a popular scene of hare hunting. And as the Rambam says, Hamevin Yevin. Those who understand will understand, right? This is a fantasy of a wish for.
Okay, John, let me stop you for 1 second. Marga, maybe I'm gonna spotlight you for a second. You can put that book back up.
I don't see what you're. Okay, we'll see in a minute. Yeah, that is the first picture, right? And then I have the second one also next to it. I got it. So the first edition just had that one, and the second edition has both, that one and the second one. I'm guessing she's getting the second one now. Okay, now here's where things get a little more interesting. I have to use a little more imagination. This took a while to figure out, but it was a lot of fun. I'm going to show you a picture with the hares in it, a Haggadah with hares in it, but there's no hunting, and it's not German. Okay, oh, she's going to show that other picture. You have the other picture there you want to show? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to show you the other one while you look for that. Okay, this is not from a German-speaking country. This one is from 200 years earlier, and it's from Spain. So forget all the German here. Oops, that's not what we want. Come on. All right, let's get the next picture that we want. Here it is. This is from the Barcelona Haggadah. Beautiful illuminated book. There's only one copy. It's in the British Library. On the right, you can see in the blue box there near the top, Avadim, and it continues below, Hayinu in the top right, top left there. The Pharaoh of Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. What is on the page with Avadim Hayinu? Look at, you can see the picture of the Jews doing their construction projects, the supervisors on horseback, ordering them to work harder and build these towers. And look carefully on the top of the page, on the top of the frame. The hare is not the prey of a hunter. The hare, is sitting on a golden throne and being served a goblet of wine by a bowing, obsequious dog. The dog has now become the servant of the hare, not the hunter. Clearly a wish for a reversal of roles here. And the other picture on the left, if you look below, you see the Hebrew, Borei Morei Ha'esh. This is from Havdalah. God separates between Sabbath and the week, between the Israelites and the other nations, between sacred and profane. And you can see what the separation is here. Here, the hare is wearing a fancy cape with a cowl, with a hood. He's using a stick to control or beat the dog. And a very modestly dressed pig in a long dress and a hair covering is serving a huge goblet of wine to the hair. So apparently this is the fantasy that they've been harassing us, and now if only we could be fully free and they would serve us. It's tempting there's no proof for this, but it's tempting to think that the three animals on the left, bearing in mind this is from Spain, medieval Spain went back and forth between Christian and Muslim control and was a society where all three groups lived, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, that to think that the pig and the dog may represent the Christian and the Muslim. I'm not sure which is which. Maybe the pig is the Christian because Muslims don't have anything to do with pigs. We don't know for sure, but clearly you can see, again, just as in the German case, lots of resentment and frustration is coming out here in graphic form, meant to be communicated just to those who understand, so not to incur the wrath of anyone who's going to make trouble for you. Okay, I think, let's see, I think we're going to quit there with this. Let me just show you one more thing here. If you find this sort of thing interesting, there are a couple of things you can do. First of all, a rabbi mentioned my website, torahflora.org, so that you can click on Haggadah there. It has information about the Haggadah. There's the reviews and a link to the publisher's page with more information, and you can see some sample pages there, and you can order it there if you like. You can also join my email list, which I do not share with anyone. People on the list will get advance notice of all my new publications and talks, and if they request, I can give them a coupon code for a discount on a set of 4 or more Haggadahs. You can also get it on Amazon and so forth, but they are not going to start shipping until the 15th. The price is the same. Okay, so that's available to anybody. I'll just leave that up, I guess, for anybody who wants it. Let's see, we have some questions. Somebody compared the use of animals to mouse. That's an interesting observation. It is a similar idea. People still do that, don't they? And in fact, children's cartoons, you'll often see different animals characterized as different sorts of people. I'm looking in the chat to see if there are any questions here. Let's see. Raise hand. I don't see. Somebody has Bugs Bunny here. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. So one of the things I did after I wrote the Haggadah, I realized people are going to read this, they're going to wind up lecturing at their Seder and boring everybody to death. So what I decided to do is I put together a little document, just about a page and a half, which I'm giving out to anybody who wants it, which is Seder tips, how you can use the information in the Haggadah to enliven the Seder and enrich the Seder without giving a lecture. For example, one of the things I suggested was get a little toy rabbit and bring it to the Seder and put it on the table and let people ask about it, and then you can explain what that's all about. Another was to follow the suggestion of some of the Rishonim, which is, you remember the question, the 4 questions about the bitter herb that says, on other nights we eat other vegetables, sha'ar yirakot. So fine, let's make the contrast as striking as possible to provoke more questions. Put out a crudité platter with celery sticks and carrot sticks and cucumber slices and all kinds of other vegetables and the maror, and then don't eat the other vegetables. So let this be a source of provocation of questions. So the children will look and say, wait a minute, why'd you put out that salad? Now we got to eat all this other stuff. And how come it's on the table, but you're not eating it? What's the story? So all of these kinds of little tips, things you can do like that to provoke discussion. So I can send that to anybody who wants to request it. Okay, somebody's asking for my email. Let me put that back up there. I think it was on that slide. Yes, it is here. You can see the second bullet point here, john@torahflora.org. Okay, if you're interested in any other information or you want the coupon code for a discount or you want a copy of Seder tips, I'm happy to send that to anybody. Just send me an email, or you can just put your email address in the chat now and I'll get it from there. That's also a possibility. Okay, so jon@torahflora.org.
John, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I can unmute myself, unlike the rest of you, but you know, a friend of mine showed me a video of a Latin American like pit barbecue recipe, and the person, this is a contemporary, I think they're Mexican, although maybe a different Central American country. The person described this roast that she did. She was making this pit barbecue, and she put these bitter leaves on the roasting. And it makes me wonder, the maror, as we have it, is like a kind of a condiment, you know, to go with the korban. Do you have any thought about like the, so to speak, recipe of, because the rabbinic sources add that it's very, very super minimalist, But I'm al matzot u'marorim yochluhu. You have to eat this thing. You have to eat the flesh of the lamb, on the unleavened bread with the marorim, with the bitter herbs. And I wonder if, like in other Middle Eastern cultures or whatever, there's like a culinary reason for maror.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the fact that we introduced it as kach, how you Hillel hayavs, right? So this was Hillel's little shtick. This was something he used to do. I think what it was that he was being especially zealous and taking it literally and saying we're going to eat them all in one bite. But I also had the impression from the Torah that it's a condiment. I think that's right. It has this other meaning, though. I think that midrash that's inherent in the in the whole story. I haven't come across specifically, other kinds of lamb recipes from the Middle East that survive today. And because they have lots of other historical influences by now. But I think that's probably part of it. Is it was meant to be a combination like that. Bitter things usually are not eaten wholesale, for their own sake. You wouldn't eat a bitter herb like you would eat, broccoli or peas or carrots or something. You use a little bit for a seasoning. So that may be part of it. There is a hint of something else for a completely unrelated reason. I didn't get into the story tonight. There's a whole botany and physics story about the fact that the Talmud says that when you roast the Korban Pesach, you should impale it on a spit made of pomegranate wood from a pomegranate tree less than 3 years old. And it has to do with not using a metal spit because then it will heat on the ends and it'll conduct the heat to the inside and cook from the inside out instead of cooking directly from the heat of the fire. And there's a whole other story about that we didn't get into tonight. But the pomegranate wood is interesting. Pomegranate wood, I don't think has this fragrance or the flavor of pomegranates the way that, for example, citrus wood does or cherry wood does of the fruit. However, it does contain a compound called isopolydrine, which is toxic to intestinal worms. And of course, we're supposed to put the intestines back inside, stuff them inside, or in one version, there was an opinion to pile them on the head of the carcass. Some people used to call it the helmeted Paschal lamb for that reason. So that may also have had a health purpose as well. I don't know if people were aware of this at the time, or they're just sort of an ancillary benefit, but there seemed to be.
Wait, explain this to me, because I have always wondered about that. I've heard about that intestine on the head thing, but it's rosho al kira'av be'al kirbo. You're supposed to tie it into a ball, so to speak. How could you eat an animal without disemboweling it? Wouldn't that make everybody sick?
Well, you can take the intestines out and clean them and then put them back in or pile them on the head. For sure you can clean it, but the point was it has to be complete. It doesn't have to be intact, unbutchered, but you have to reassemble it. And they talk about putting the intestines. One opinion was to stuff them back inside and tie the legs up. Another was to pile them on the head. Everything has to be there, but you can certainly clean everything before you roast it, or broil it. Really, would actually be a better word for that. Someone asked if you can find pomegranate wood here. There are some. Yeah, I have a photo somewhere actually of a 3-year-old pomegranate tree. The point is that it doesn't have many branches yet at that age, and so you won't have knots in the wood that would leak sap out to kind of steam the wood from the inside. And that's why the Talmud rules out oak and other kinds of wood that have wider pores filled with the xylem vessels filled with liquid that could then steam the meat from the inside. But yeah, I think of it as a kind of a burrito with. Remember, Hillel's matzah would have been soft, and when we call korech, making the sandwich. So in modern Hebrew, that means to stack things up like in a sandwich. If you have a multi-volume book, like an encyclopedia, the volumes are called korechim. But in Mishnaic Hebrew, it doesn't mean that. It means to roll something up. It's used in the Mishnah to describe like a snake wrapping itself around someone's leg, for example, or about wrapping up a package, because the matzah was soft. It actually says when you have the 2.5 matzahs and you're ready to eat them, so you stuff the partial one in the piece inside the whole one, not lay them together, but stuff it inside. So it's sort of like putting one pita inside another. So I think of this as a kind of not a sandwich, but a burrito where you've got some meat and some herbs for seasoning and some charoset in there. And you would actually have 2 kinds of meat, because you had the Korban Pesach, which was lamb, and the Korban Chagiga, the festival offering, which was beef. So it's kind of a mixed grill and quite a full meal. Okay, so someone asked about horseradish here. I didn't tell the whole story about horseradish. Horseradish basically was adopted by Ashkenazim in Northern and Eastern Europe when they couldn't get any kind of herbs early in the spring. That's why some people still use potato or radish for their karpas for the same reason. But horseradish has none of the criteria that the Talmud describes for maror. And as Rabbi Asher Weiss pointed out, it's not even bitter. It's sharp, right? But it's not really bitter. Someone asked about nutting, roasted meat at the Seder. So this isn't a good example where opposite practices have the same meaning. Ashkenazim typically do not have roasted meat at the Seder to remind us that we don't have the Korban Pesach. Sephardim eat roasted meat at the Seder to remind them of the Korban Pesach. So we're doing opposite things for the same reason. So that's why someone asked about that. Let's see. Someone asked about talking about being a vegetarian. So if you're a vegetarian, by the way, the Talmud discusses several options for the Seder plate, the two cooked dishes, besides the bone and the egg that we use today. Those don't appear until later, till the Gaonim. And we're not clear where they came from. It just appears all of a sudden in the literature. We don't know where it came from, folk practice. One of the options in the Talmud is to use rice and chard. So I have a picture in the Haggadah. Actually, if you look at the Times of Israel, they published a review recently where they used that picture at the beginning of the story of a vegetarian Seder plate. We used this one year when we had a vegetarian at the Seder who didn't even want to see meat on the table. So we don't use rice because we're Ashkenazic, so we used quinoa, which is a more recent development. But you can do that. The point is to have two cooked dishes, and what they stand for are the Korban Pesach and the Korban Chagiga. That's why, by the way, many of us can begin the meal with eggs, hard-boiled eggs and salt water. That comes from the egg on the Seder plate. It stands in for the Korban Chagiga. And the Vilna Gaon actually would eat the egg, and that was his dinner. And strictly speaking, if you're using it for that, really the egg and the meat on the bone should be eaten by lunch the next day, since that plate represents the actual meal. What else do we have? There's some other comments here. Let's see. Filtered ground lamb. Okay, that would be a kofta. Yeah, lettuce instead of horseradish. Yes, definitely. So it's not that critical a point nowadays. There is no independent mitzvah in the Torah to eat maror. The mitzvah is to eat your Korban Pesach with maror. We don't have a Korban Pesach, so it's rabbinic today. So it's not that critical, right? If you have a tradition to use horseradish, it's not so terrible to keep using it, but you should understand that it could lead you in the wrong direction, and it has brought many of us a misconception about what the meaning of maror is. So if you're adamant to keep that horseradish custom, you can, but it would be more authentic and more closer to the intended meaning, as the Talmud describes it, to use lettuce, even if it seems strange to you that it's not bitter. That's, as he said, that's the Talmud explains, that's not the point, right? It's not to blow your head off. It's to remind you that you need to be watchful. Okay, other questions? Let's see. So Rabbi Jeremy, one or two people put their emails in there. If you can get those to me later, maybe from the recording, it should give you the chat text as well. I'll get those. Oh, here's one. Here's this. Let me see if I can copy this here. All right, I think I can do that. Other questions?
All right, everybody. Well,
I think there's just
thank
one.
you. Thank you very much to everybody, both of those 20-some members of our community and those two not so nice people who were who were bothering us at the beginning. I've been on, like all of you, I've been on massive amounts of Zoom for the last year, and this is the first vandalism that I've experienced. So that was kind of unfortunate. So we're sorry about that, and I hope it doesn't happen again in any of our other stuff. But we're very, very grateful to a wonderful teacher who's a Talmid Chacham about Judaism and a Talmid Chacham about science and biology, and sometimes gets summoned in to teach other classes at the Heschel High School besides biology. And lots of the kids of our community have been your students, and we're very grateful for you to come in today. And check out TorahFlora.org and enjoy some of John's insights.
Thank you all very much. It's a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
So the people who asked about the recording, it is recording. We will we'll send it to John, and Doron Ruskay here in the office will have the recording. And he will enable you, if you write to him, druskay, DRUSKAY @anshakasa.org. He will send you the record. He will send you the link to it. Keep in mind, everybody, that the way this works, I don't know if you know this, that the Zoom recordings, like they live on the cloud for like 30 days or something like that. So if you want to get this recording, please write to Doron in the shul within the next like, the next week will be great. Do it before Pesach, and then you'll be able to get the recording. All right, everybody, wishing you well, and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all. All right. Steph, I'll go to your link next, I guess.